Hello, MCU fans! Today is the final video in my closeout of the MCU in 2025. Now, I've covered 6 different topics over the last several weeks. You can check out some of those videos if you missed them, but today we'll be talking about the state of the MCU. Where are we as 2025 closes out? So, lots to discuss. Let's dive right in and see what we can find out. Don't forget, we have a November contest running all month long. Be a subscriber, leave a comment, and 5 random winners can choose from a book or a steelbook. Best of luck. We also have a membership option with lots of cool perks, so you might check it out. Plus, hang around to the end of the video, and I'll talk about the What If Pitch contest on the Discord. Alright, so for this first section of the video, we're going to take a perspective check across the MCU using Rotten Tomato scores. And I do realize it's not a perfect measurement, but it does rate both movies and shows, so it lets us look at things across the full spectrum of the MCU. Alright, so let's start by looking at Phase 1. Notice the average critic total is 80%, and the average general total is 79%. So pretty much in sync between critics and the general audience, and you can see that across the board here. Then we move to Phase 2. Notice both scores went up a little bit. The critic score to 81% and the general audience score at 84%. But notice again, critics and the general audience are basically in agreement about how they felt each of these movies fared overall. Then we move to Phase 3. Now we jump to 89% for the critic score and 83% for the total score. And now we do start to see some disparities between critics and the general audience, in particular with Black Panther and Captain Marvel. Notice the critics liked those movies a lot better than the general audience based on the total Rotten Tomatoes score. I'm not going to get into why I think the general audience score is so much lower. You can probably come up with your own reasons, but I'm just pointing out that we start to see this disparity between critics and the general audience, and it started in Phase 3. All right, so now let's move to Phase 4. And for now, I'm going to break it apart between movies and shows. So on the movie front, the critics were a lot harsher than the general audience, 76% versus 88% for the aggregate. And we can see that disparity particularly in Eternals. I mean, it wasn't my favorite movie, but 47% by the critics? Ouch, that is really low. And then we also see disparity with Thor: Love and Thunder. Again, not one of my favorite movies, but I don't think it deserves a 64% necessarily. And then we also see disparity between the critics and the general audience on Wakanda Forever and Black Widow. So it's really interesting. Critics overall were harsher on the MCU movies in Phase 4. Then we move to the TV shows in Phase 4, and notice now the scores have flipped. The critics overall were happier, 90% on the average, and the general fan base was lower, 80%. So let's look at the disparities here. Well, you can definitely see them in how the critics versus the general audience viewed both Ms. Marvel and She-Hulk. Critics were a lot happier with both entries. Now, I will say 32% for She-Hulk, that's way too low, in my opinion. I mean, it's not the best show, but it's not that bad. But on the other hand, I don't think the critics are right with Ms. Marvel. That is not worth 98%. Notice it's the number 2 ranked show in critics' minds. No, I don't buy that. So it's just interesting that we start seeing this disconnect between the critics and the general audience. I mean, that's going to get even more severe as we dive further into the analysis. All right, so now let's go to Phase 5. We're going to look at the movies first and then the TV shows. Notice the critics, oh my word, 67% on the average for critics versus the general audience, 86%. That is a huge difference, almost 20% difference. So why are we seeing that happen? Well, first of all, Deadpool and Wolverine. Critics, not real happy with that movie, versus the general audience, 94%. That is really strong. Yet the critics put it as the 26th ranked movie. Ouch. And then we move to the lower ranked movies in Phase 5, and notice the critics were much more severe. I mean, 20-30% difference, just wild, absolutely wild. All right, so then let's move to the TV shows in Phase 5. And now once again, things have flipped. The critics are at 81%, general audience 64%. So let's look at some of the reasons for that. Well, first of all, we do have the lowest ranked shows. And if we look at that, huge disparity between where the critics rated them and where the general audience rated them. I mean, it's low ratings across the board, especially Secret Invasion, but the difference in Ironheart, look at that, 77% versus 46%. That is wild. Then we got situations like Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, where the critics liked it way more than the general audience. How did that only get a 62%? It's the 3rd highest ranked show, according to critics, but the general audience, 62%. And then both seasons of What If, critics were, liked it, but didn't say it was great. But on the other hand, the general audience, 62% and 33% for What If Season 3. Oh my word. I mean, it was my least favorite season, but man, that is savage. All right, so then let's move to phase 6. Because there's only 3 entries, I've combined the shows and the movies together. But notice the critics higher, 81% versus the general audience at 70%. And one of the biggest reasons for the disparity is Eyes of Wakanda. Wow, I do not understand how the critics liked it that much and how the general audience disliked it that much. I would put it somewhere in the middle. I enjoyed it. Wasn't the best show out there, but certainly was not a 52%. Okay, so now let's take this information and summarize it up by phase. So notice we have phase 1 through 6, and for phases 4 through 6, I'm combining the movies and the TV shows. All right, so let's look at the differences between the critic score and the total score. All right, so for the critics, notice their highest ranked phase was phase 3, but interestingly, their second most highest ranked phase was phase 4. Did you see that coming? I mean, I didn't see that coming. That's wild because a lot of people have, varied opinions about phase 4. But from a critic score, it's the second highest ranked. The audience score, on the other hand, 84% for phase 2, so that was the highest ranked phase. But I'm shocked again. Even the audience said the second and third best phases at a tie were 83%, phase 3 and phase 4. Did not see that coming. That is wild. Okay, so now let's do an interesting exercise and add in the Netflix shows. Because notice, for phase 2 and phase 3, I didn't say and TV. So recently, Marvel has added in the Netflix shows as official canon. And, we can talk about the fact that Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is also canon. Marvel just isn't acknowledging it right now. But these shows are now official canon. So we're going to add in the scores if you include the Netflix shows. And this is fascinating. So watch what happens. First of all, from a critic standpoint, whoa, look at that change. Critics went from 81 and then 89 to 84 and then 81. Whoa. And likewise, the general audience score jumped up for phase 2 and down for phase 3. Why is that happening? Well, because the earlier seasons of the Netflix shows were much better. Let's be honest. Daredevil season 1, Jessica Jones season 1. The shows that land in phase 2 are much higher ranked. And then the ones that land in phase 3 are some of the lower ranked seasons, whether it's Iron Fist, Defenders, the third season of like Jessica Jones, etc. So very interesting. So now we actually see that the favorite phase was phase 2 for both critics and fans across the board. Phase 2. Isn't that wild? Okay, so now let's do another analysis. We're going to break it down by year. And we're going to start by just looking at the movie scores, and then we'll layer in the TV shows, and this is where things get fascinating. All right, so notice from a critic standpoint, the best 2 years were 2012 and 2014, both at a 91%. And that makes sense because critics really seem to like phase 2, right? But then when we contrast that with the overall score, the top 2 years were 2024 and 2014. And that's because Deadpool and Wolverine was the only movie that came out in 2024. And of course, the general audience ranked that very, very high. Okay, so now here's what's fascinating. Let's layer in the Disney Plus shows. So the only years that's going to affect are 2021 through 2025. So first, focus on the critic scores and watch how every single score goes up. Here we go. Boom. Look at that. Every single score. We're now in the 80s across the board, other than 2023 at 69. But now if I go back, before we layered that in, notice it was a 64. So we had all 70s and a 64, and we jumped to all 80s and a 69. On the other hand, let's watch what happened to the general audience score, the total score. We have 2 years in the 90s, and all the rest are in the 80s. And look at what happens. My word, 2021 drops to 89%, but 2022 through 2025 drop all the way down into the 70s. So what does this tell us? It tells us that overall critics feel that Disney Plus enhanced their viewing experience. Everything went up. But on the flip side, for the general audience, for the total score on Rotten Tomatoes, it went down. So the general audience feels that Disney Plus reduced their viewing enjoyment. And you know what? That's kind of what we're hearing. We're hearing this quote-unquote fatigue from all the TV shows. Now, not for me. I really like the Disney Plus shows, but you can't argue these numbers. For the general fandom, entertainment level went down because of the Disney Plus shows. Craziness, right? All right, so now when you layer in the Disney Plus shows, now the critics and the general audience agree 2012 and 2014 were the best years in the MCU when you go year by year. Okay, so then just for the fun of it, let's throw in the Netflix shows. We kind of seen how this affects things, but let's add those in as well. Notice we're going to see 2015 go substantially up, and every other year go substantially down. So boom. Look at that. Isn't that crazy? So I'll go back again. You can see that we were at 79 and 84 in 2015, and those numbers went up, but then every other year went down. Went substantially down in 2017. Look at that in 2017. 90% and 87% went down to 73 and 82. So yeah, there's no doubt that when you add in the Netflix shows, things went down each year from 2015 to 2019. Okay, finally, let's talk about why we see this slow decline as we go from 2022 to 2025. You can see it a little bit in the critic score. I mean, 2023 was the lowest year for the critics, but still, these scores are lower. But look at the general audience score, 78, 74, 72, 71. Wow, that's pretty crazy, right? So let's talk about this decline, why it happened, and what Disney is doing to take care of it. All right, so why did things dip from 2022 on? Lots of reasons. First of all, the firing of James Gunn. It's easy to forget this because it was so long ago, but Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 was going to help kick off Phase 4 and move things more into outer space and give us space-related stories, etc. No, all that changed when James Gunn was fired, so that really was a big deal. Then we have the coronavirus. That obviously affected things that came out in 2020, but really that had an effect for every year forward, changed so many plans. And then we have the tragic death of Chadwick Boseman. Black Panther was going to be one of the biggest characters starting out in Phase 4 and really kicking things off. And of course, he passed away and that changed everything. And then we have the whole situation with Jonathan Majors. Whether or not you agree with Disney letting him go, the bottom line is that changed and helped pivot from Kang to Doctor Doom, a pivot they were probably starting to do anyway after the performance of Quantumania, but certainly with his situation, it changed everything. Then you have Bob Chapek, or many people call him Bob Paycheck, right? Because he was pushing for more quantity over quality. That might actually be one of the biggest things that hurt Marvel, when they were pushing so many Disney Plus shows and, honestly, so many movies. Huge, huge deal. And then we move to Disney buying 20th Century Fox, which on the surface seems like a wonderful thing, right? Now suddenly we have access to the Fantastic Four and the X-Men. Celebration, right? Well, it took a while for Marvel to figure out how do we pivot and bring these characters in. We saw little peeks of the X-Men and the Fantastic Four in movies like Multiverse of Madness, obviously, with Reed Richards and Professor X. But it just took a while for Marvel to figure out the strategy of bringing in these new properties and these new characters. And then finally, the writer's strike. Obviously, that's one of the most recent things that really hurt Disney, really hurt every company out there, every movie studio out there, but certainly hurt plans and delayed things by as much as a year. I mean, if you look at all of these issues that Disney had to deal with, oh my word. I mean, it's just amazing we got anything, right? It's amazing we got any Marvel content, let alone some of the good things that we have gotten from 2022 and on. So now let's talk about what Disney, and in particular Marvel, is doing to address these issues. Well, I think it's huge that Bob Iger has publicly admitted that they made mistakes. I mean, obviously one of them was the quantity over quality, but another one was message over story. I mean, Iger has admitted there was too much focus on message and not enough on good storytelling. Now, an example of where that really affected things, I would argue, is She-Hulk. Again, I like She-Hulk. I didn't rate it as low as some people do on their lists, but the reason a lot of people rank it so low is there was a lot of message in that show. Maybe too much message and not enough story. So these are some of the things that Marvel and Disney are applying, and I think we're going to continue to see the quality going up because of that. All right, what are some of the other issues? Well, the multiverse stories have seemed very disconnected. So for example, here is Phase 2 and Phase 3, and notice we have these Avengers movies that are these gathering points for all the different storylines, so it really felt like everything kept culminating and coming together. But if we look at Phase 4, it's kind of all over the place, right? We really needed a big Avengers team up during the end of Phase 4, and we didn't get it. So everything just continued kind of going everywhere, right? And it continued into Phase 5. Everything was just kind of spreading out. And I will say, big improvement by the end of Phase 5 with Thunderbolts, Brave New World, and Daredevil Born Again. Notice a lot of those lines are coming together. It wasn't enough, it didn't bring all the stories together, but it's definitely a move in the right direction. And I think we're going to continue to see that in Phase 6 as we head towards Doomsday, and thank goodness, everything is going to come together. It's going to be carnage, it's going to be crazy, but all these lines are finally going to come back together, and I don't think Marvel will make this mistake again when we go into Phase 7. I don't think we're going to see everything go crazy. Instead, we're going to see these more focused stories. All right, let's talk about 2025's movie slate. I mean, it had some good news, and it had some bad news. Obviously, bad news is these are not the box office numbers that Marvel's used to. They're used to seeing movies that make 700,000, 800,000, even a billion plus. So, yes, financially, these were disappointments from a box office standpoint. But we have to keep in mind there's more than just the box office. Let's just take Fantastic Four, for example. The marketing in Fantastic Four was insane. There were so many promotional things across that movie, and it doesn't really that distracting, to be honest. But here's just one example of the 7-Up. I mean, very prominent in the movie. And then we have to remember digital sales and physical sales, those are also very important for the overall profit of a movie. Then we have all the toy tie-ins. A lot of money to be made there. Then we have the comics. Obviously, Fantastic Four had a tie-in comic, but just comics in general get a boost when you see their characters in a movie. And then lastly, the Disney parks. This is probably one of Disney/Marvel's sweet spots. Not only do they make money on everything else, but this draws more people into the parks because notice the Fantastic Four are already showing up in the parks. So I don't want to diminish the fact that these box office numbers are too low. We can't keep seeing them be at this level. But we have to remember that there's a lot more than just box office. So that's really cool. Okay, something else to look at. These Rotten Tomato scores are moving in the right direction. I mean, obviously, Captain America Brave New World, that's not great. But if you look at Thunderbolts and you look at Fantastic Four First Steps, both the critics and the general audience scores are pretty solid, if not really solid. So yes, the box office is lower, but fans left the movie theaters going, this is a step in the right direction. We liked these movies. That's good. Marvel needs to keep that up. We obviously have Brand New Day and Doomsday coming, so this is a step in the right direction. Marvel needs to keep that up. And in fact, the entire 2026 slate looks like it's going to be really solid for the MCU. I think we're seeing more and more of this push towards quality, focus on story, and that is going to help the critics and the general fandom be much more happy with the MCU. All right, so now let's talk about the open questions, because that really is a big issue. People don't like when there's a lot of open-ended issues, and we have 80 of them, 80 things hanging out there. But I do want to point out, I've been tracking this for 4 years, and the number has risen for 3 years in a row, but finally, in 2025, the number went down. I know, it's still 80, that's a lot, but look at that. We finally started to head in the right direction. And as I talked about in my video, while there's 80 open questions, nearly half of them look like they're going to be answered in 2026. That is incredible. And it's possible that if we get lucky in 2027, we could be down to 30-some questions by the end of the year. Oh my word, that would be great. Let's also look at the fact that there are a ton of heroes to juggle. In my video, I talked about 122 active heroes. So how is Marvel addressing this situation? Well, first of all, they're dividing them into groups and teams. So we have the teams that we know are showing up in Doomsday, Avengers, Thunderbolts, Fantastic Four, and X-Men. And then we're also going to see the Wakandans. Then we have the teams that may not show up in the movie, or at least may only be in cameo in the case of Guardians of the Galaxy, but they're still a team. They've grouped these heroes together, and that's important. And then I'm still guessing that we may see all of these three teams forming either during Phase 6 or certainly by the time we get to Phase 7. So that's important. Marvel needs to keep these team groupings together because that helps the 122 heroes seem much more manageable. Plus, I think we're going to see a lot of heroes ending their journeys during Doomsday and Secret Wars. So we'll see that 122 go down a lot. And then finally, I think it's so important that clarity is coming for the multiverse structure. You know, I've shown this image over and over again. This is how I think the MCU is set up. I think there's multiple trees across that multiverse, with 616 being a tree, etc. But we're going to find out the answers because over in the X-Men tree, if you will, Monica's over there hanging out with the X-Men. That's going to cause an incursion. In the Fantastic Four tree, we see that at least some members of the team appear to be coming over to 616. And of course, in the Spider Bros trees, we know they're going to be showing up. And in fact, I think we'll see lots more heroes from across different multiversal trees. So I do think Doomsday is going to clarify this structure, and we're going to start to see the incursions between these different trees. And of course, that leads to one of the most exciting things ahead, and that is going to be the trailer for Doomsday. We should be getting that in December. Fingers crossed, it is going to be amazing. So that leads us to our final question. What is the state of the MCU as 2025 closes out? I'm sure that many times this year, that was Feige's face, right? Not necessarily a happy camper. But hey, Kevin, here's the good news. So much good stuff coming in 2026, and I really think the lessons that have been learned during some of these difficult years have been applied, and that these entries are going to be fantastic. So I think the state of the MCU is solid, and they're heading into 2026 in a position of strength. And I think we're going to see Feige's face change from that to this, because there is so much to look forward to, And I firmly believe the MCU is on a roll. So let me know your thoughts. What do you think the state of the MCU is? Do you think I was too hard on it? Or do you think I was too soft on it? Are you excited about 2026? Do you think Marvel has applied the lessons they've learned? And are you excited about the things ahead? So leave your thoughts. You know I love to read and respond to them all. Plus, don't forget, November contest, be a subscriber, leave a comment, win a book or a steelbook, and there's the membership option in case you're interested in that. Plus, I mentioned I would talk about the What If Pitch contest on the Discord. Here's the rules, but the TLDR is join the Discord and either supply your title or a title and a summary for your episode. And notice the deadline is December 11th. And then finally, we have the Doomsday Countdown Watch on the Discord. We're experimenting with a 2 p.m. as well as a 7 p.m. watch time for every show and movie listed here. And we're heading towards the December 18, 2026 release of Doomsday. So we have 2,500 members across the globe, conversations 24/7, and I'll leave a pinned comment so you can join. Also, if you don't mind, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. You can check out more content, and we'll all continue to enjoy the ever-growing, the ever-changing Marvel Cinematic Universe.